thought of one thing on the line, but I'll just stick to what I had originally planned for now. About 3 weeks ago, I think, Eric and Jamie had been talking to someone and brought up the topic of like human rights in relation to non-human beings. Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting topic that I've thought of before, actually. So I was wondering if you had had any time to think of it, or if Tracie had any thoughts on the subject before I started talking about my thoughts on it.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on it. I'd like you to start by defining what you describe as a right.
I suppose the best way to do it would be like in the legal sense. Like if some non-human entity was like petitioning for the right to be recognized as human from the government or something like that.
Okay, which non-human entity would be petitioning to be human?
Well, in my opinion, it doesn't really matter.
Well, it kind of does, because I'm unaware of any non-human entities that would have the wherewithal to petition for such a thing. So I'm wondering what you've got in mind. I mean, are we talking about this in real terms, like as it would apply to reality as we know it, or are we talking about this from a hypothetical standpoint?
Just a hypothetical.
Okay.
About 3 weeks ago, if I remember the call right, someone had talked about how octopi, a specific kind of octopus, was observed showing characteristics of sapience and empathy and
oh, I have no problem. I'm just saying that if we were going to assign them legal rights in the human societal system, mm-hmm. how would an octopus understand? How would we explain that to the octopus, right?
Right.
I mean, so, but what he's saying is that we're going to go about this and say, for example, aliens arrive and they have the capacity to communicate with us and we're assuming that they somehow understand our social constructs and can understand and conform to our mode of governance, and that they share our ideas on governance and all of that, right? That's kind of the hypothetical.
More or less.
Okay.
So, I was thinking more along the lines of like what beings would be entitled to rights instead of, like what would we hash out with like aliens?
I think when it comes to rights, right, first of all, you'd have to be able to understand the system under which your rights are functioning. And then secondly, as a species, now let's get that straight too, because this is a species specific thing. This is not about, so when people sometimes get into this, they'll say, well, there are human beings that are incapable of understanding. It's like, yes, but we apply this as a human control. It applies to human beings, and we understand that there are outliers. And yet, but when it comes to, for example, applying it to a turtle, no turtle can understand the construct. It's not like turtles generally can understand the human governance, and there are a few turtles that can't, and so certainly we should include turtles, even though we would have to make concessions for the few turtles on the fringe. So when you're talking about the idea of another species coming in, and they have capacity to communicate, they have capacity to understand the system, and they have the desire, right, the agency to express the desire to participate in that system, right? You'd have to have all those things, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I would say at a point where their desire is to participate, where they seem to be, what we're basically describing is like human beings that come from somewhere else, and they might look a little different, but if they can communicate, they can understand the system, they understand rights and obligations, and they're willing to adhere to it, I would be okay extending that and saying, well, then we'll call it whatever kind of rights we want to call it. We would probably have to change it from, it would still be legal rights, right? I'm a little iffy on the idea of like, quote, human rights. It's not that I am against it. It's just that it's a little more fuzzy than when you have like legal rights within a legal system that are more constructed in a way that delineates those rights in a clear manner. Because then you can actually get to the meat of it and say, here's what this system is saying you have a right to do versus what you don't have a right to do. And then you can argue about whether or not people should be denied those rights, or should they, or should have those rights. But when you're talking about human rights, it's a little difficult because you're trying to apply broadly rights to many, many people who may in general have some agreement about what should be included in that basket, but not everybody does, and so it gets a lot more fuzzy. That's the only reason I have issues with it, because it's much harder to nail down what your human rights are, because there are many manifestos, and even though there's many similarities, there are also some differences, and it can get a little squirrely.
Yeah,
I understand.
I have given it quite a bit of thought. And I don't have a great answer, but I can kind of take you along the journey that I've been going, at least so far. And when we talked about it before, it was kind of in this Kantian sense of rights. And I disagree to an extent about how we apply those rights, about means and ends. And a lot of it has to do with the way I view free will. I think when you talk about application of rights, you're coming from a deontological perspective that I don't agree with entirely, because I don't know if we have free will. So let's say we had an alien species come down and exhibit all of the traits of what we would consider an intelligent, empathetic being that we would want to give rights to, right? How do we apply that? And I really don't know.
What would give you the concern?
So it's the same concern that goes with the argument in general, even with humans, is how we treat legal system with free will, because people bring up the argument, oh, well, if you don't have free will, people can't be accountable for their actions. No,
right, but what he's describing is a group of beings that would be pretty much like we start drilling in Antarctica and we find human beings down there, and they say, hey, we'd like to participate in your system of justice. And we say, okay. Now, if we drilled down and there were like humanoids, but they weren't necessarily Homo sapiens, and they said this. I mean, the necessary features that we would apply legal rights to each other with would then be there with these other beings. I mean, there would be, I can't think of any reason that we would want to. The only reasons that I know that we don't or can't assign rights to things that aren't human is that we have no way to incorporate those things into the legal system, where they would be able to avail themselves of the rights that, all the things it would like. I mean, what are we going to do? Like assign attorneys to oversee every squirrel? It's like you.
That was actually in the comments.
Yeah, I mean, you, and then what do you do when when a dog attacks a squirrel? Do you put the dog up on murder? How do you? What do you do with this? Because it's because that's why I wanted to know what were you describing as rights? Because some people confuse protections with rights. Protections are not rights.
So I have a question for you, Scott.
Yes.
Are you a vegan?
No, I am not, and I anticipated that you would bring that up, but no, that's not where I wanted to direct the conversation.
I think he's asking you that a little bit facetiously, because when I saw this earlier, I don't know if it was there when Eric looked at it, but when I saw it earlier, they actually had called that out, that he says he's not a vegan. The screeners gave us a little tip there.
All right. Well, rock on, man. I appreciate the thought.
I'd like to talk a little bit, though, about protections versus rights, though, because I think this confuses a lot of folks, right? So we assign protections to certain things, and people sometimes will say, well, that's a demonstration of rights, and it's not. A protection is not a right. When you have the right, it's an inherent thing to you that is applied to you by virtue of the fact that you are a participant in the culture in our society. And so, like when I was talking about the dog killing the squirrel, if a dog attacks you and tries to kill you, our society will defend you. Our society will do what we can to protect you. Our society will come together and try and stop this thing. And yet when we see, for example, like, a pack of wolves hunting an elk in Yellowstone, we're not going to jump in and, even though there's protections on the elk in Yellowstone, the wolves can kill them. But they can't kill a human being who is camping at the park or traveling through the park. So as that right goes with the person, but the protection is applied, and it's a restriction on human behavior, right? So a protection on a national forest has to do with how human beings treat that forest. You can't set it on fire. You can't throw your litter on the ground there. You can't leave a fire, untended. And, so there's all these rules that have to do with how you treat a national park. It's protected which means that human beings understand as the society, we have laws that tell us what we can and cannot do in relation to that property. And that's the same thing we apply to animals that are not human. And some people get confused and think that this constitutes a right, but it doesn't. It's usually a restriction on human behaviors and what we can or cannot do in regard to this animal, what we're required to do, what we're not required to do. And then when, so I guess that's what I'm trying to say, is that the law, the right applies to the human, and the protection also applies to the human, not to the non-human. It can be applied even to something like a car. So for example, a car is a piece of property. You are not allowed to come in and destroy my car. You can't come and slash my tires. There's a protection on that property, right? Because it's considered to be mine and not yours, and you can't go and destroy other people's property. The properties are protected. Sometimes works of art or monuments are protected. You can't go and deface them. You can't. And so you can have protections on all manner of property. That it's not a right. It's not that this forest has rights. It's not that this car has rights. It's that people can't behave a certain way in conjunction with it. And I think a lot of times when people are trying to make arguments for non-human rights, they would probably do better to look at bolstering protections, because they're going to get a lot, I think, a lot more headway if they argue from the standpoint of protections than if they argue from the standpoint of trying to convince somebody at first that this should be rights. Because it's almost like making it, more complicated than it would need to be.
That is a really good distinction to make.
It's an important distinction to make.
I like it.
Before I go, can I bring up one thing you had mentioned about free will and justice?
Sure.
It's actually something that doesn't really seem all that incompatible to me, because if we think of humans as like meat computers instead of individual agents with free will, if one of them does something that's against our laws, if a computer behaved in a way we didn't want, we wouldn't throw the computer in jail. We would try to rehabilitate or correct it. And so if you take justice as like a rehabilitative idea instead of a punitive one, then the idea that free will and justice are incompatible kind of goes away, in my opinion.
I agree.
Here's a question. What if the computer was turned out to become a killing machine that we could not correct and we had no method to correct?
In my opinion, then the best course of action would be sequestration. And
you would sequester a computer?
I mean, assuming in the analogy that it's the equivalent of a person, but if it was, just a computer that was going around killing people, I wouldn't see any issue with destroying it, since it doesn't have the equivalent of a human mind, as far as I can tell. If it did, then I would prefer just removing it from the population to prevent further destruction.
What if you had done this with computers previously and they had gotten back into the population?
I don't
like, how far would you go to protect the population from a killing computer?
The population would have to take precedence, in my opinion.
It does.
Yeah.
That's fun. I like that. I'd actually like to continue that with a bunch of other people in the Reddit, because that actually seems like a really fun thing that people can dive into.
Yeah, I'm all for rehabilitation. By the way, I do support that standard for dealing with people who deviate in ways that harm other people. I would definitely, if there was a magic pill to fix people, I would be all in favor of let's give that pill away, like candy.
Yeah.
And I would be fine with it. I have no desire to vengefully, harm or kill or lock people up or violate them in any sorts of ways. But at the same time, I feel like the primary goal needs to be protection of the society, and the secondary goal is now that we've gotten this person away from society, what do we do with them? But the first question is, how do we stop them from hurting people? Immediately, we have to stop them from hurting people, whatever that takes. I'm not in favor of excessive, using excessive means. I would say whatever that takes reasonably to stop them from hurting people. And then after that, my concern turns to them to say, now what can we do for this person?
Yeah.
And I would imagine for like serious attempts at rehabilitation, removing them from the populace would likely be necessary.
Oh, sure. I think in most cases it probably would. I mean, some people could be probably, I feel bad because sometimes I feel like people learn a lesson from an infraction. For example, texting and driving, you know, and causing like a horrendous amount of harm from that, somebody that causes a horrible accident. And in my mind, I believe that just that experience alone might be sufficient to correct the person's behavior, that knowing that they have to live with that, they might not ever do it again. And yet there is this idea of justice not served if they don't pay in some way for the damage that is caused, right? There's this idea of compensating the victims somehow but you know, it almost seems callous toward victims to not implement some sort of repayment. And I almost wish that when it comes to the rehabilitation aspect, right, like let's say the person learned their lesson from the texting and driving. They kill somebody's child and they are feeling horrific and they are never, ever, ever gonna text and drive again because they are so traumatized by now what they are responsible for. If we wanted to really do like, hey, payback, you need some payback, I would rather see community service used as opposed to incarceration. Like, you know, let the person then, and it might even help the person feel better. Like they might feel like out of this thing, I'm now helping people and some good is coming to society to help compensate rather than me just sitting in a cell. And so the idea that we put them to work doing something productive and something that is helpful and maybe even, depending on the crime, potentially even tied to what they did. Like maybe the person could go and tell their story about how they killed people and what that has done to them and how they are wrecked by this, you know, experience and why it's important to not text and drive and how they hope no one ever has the same experience that they're having to now live with, knowing that they had killed someone. And, you know, something like that where they're actually helping to correct and improve the situation that they contributed to causing, I think would be preferable to incarcerate. I mean, just me personally. This is how I look at it.
I actually kind of agree with you on that. I know people who have been in accidents and they were at fault from texting or something like that, and they've had a boyfriend in the car or family members in the car, best friends, and the accident has caused their loved ones to die. Yeah. And then it's like, okay, now we're going to punish you. And it's like, you think that they didn't learn, you know, from the people that they love dying, like... Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing. I have a friend who years and years ago was involved in a drinking and driving accident. He was underage, and nobody was harmed except for him, and he suffered severe brain damage as a result. Took years of rehabilitation to get him back to normal. And I would be, to this day, stunned to ever hear that he took a drink and went into a car. I just don't think he would ever do that again. And when he talks about it, he tells the story and he says, you know, it was just that I would be the only person who would have been that harmed. If I had to absorb the whole, you know, impact of that, I would. And he's like, that's the way it should have worked out. Yeah, wow. So, I mean, I think that people can learn from a traumatic experience. Now, the rough thing is when somebody doesn't, right? Like you see somebody come through that and they're just like, whatever. And that's when you kind of are like, you're gonna have to hold me back on this. I'm gonna have to wait till I calm down to deal with this case because this person just doesn't care. Yeah. So. Agreed. Hey, Scott, this was a really good call, man. Thank you so much for calling in.
Well, thank you for talking to me.
You take care, all right, buddy?
Yes, you too.
All right. Before we move on to the next call, this reminds me of something. I was looking for it, and since there are people watching, maybe you can help. There was a cartoon, a really, really old one, where the premise of it was people putting their cars on trial for getting into accidents. And
like a public service type of announcement, or
no. It was a cartoon where they were blaming their cars for getting into accidents, and so the judge was sitting there, and the cars were all very guilty.
Cars don't kill people.
and then it went back in, and you know, you see people driving erratically, and it's the responsibility of the people. And I loved the way that kind of worked, because people talk about the ghost in the machine, and I think that was just such a good example of how we treat each other and how, you know, we as thinking beings approach things like justice. And If anybody knows what I'm talking about, please, because I've spent months looking for it and I've never found it.
I'm pretty sure I got skipped for jury duty for giving an answer about, they asked a question, something like, what should the primary purpose of the justice system be? Now, had they asked me, what is it, I would have had a different answer. But they gave us choices, and I chose rehabilitation. I was like, that's what it should be. And I think they didn't like that. Yeah, the prosecuting attorney probably was not happy because everyone who answered that got skipped.